hear about in the interview, I absolutely love games. Love board games. I've loved them forever. I love computer games. Don't love them as much as board games. I like playing against other people. And certainly, as we talk about in the show, I played all manner of war games. I'm sure a lot of you played history war games. It's just kind of one of those cool ways to get into history. And it's one of the things that we talk about, but we also talk about sort of just the inherent nature of why, as human beings, we love playing games. And we do. And that's important. And it's an important part of our humanity to recognize. Now, what we're not going to do in this interview is start with game 1 and get to game like 22 or something like that. That would be boring. I kind of picked and chose a couple of games that I thought were relevant and that I enjoyed playing. So those are the ones that we're kind of stuck talking about. And then I'll open it up at the end for our historian Marcus to tell us a little bit about what he thinks. But consider this to be a taste. This is a taste of all the different things that are in the books. He does a great job of breaking down sort of mathematically, how should you approach certain games? How should you approach going to a casino? The answer is don't go if you expect to make money. But at the end of the day, it's kind of about like, how do we enjoy games and what can we learn from math about how our favorite board games actually do function? And some of the answers I think are a little bit interesting. So as always, the link to purchase the book is in the show notes. I highly recommend it. And without further ado, here's the interview. I will say I did have to, you will notice in the second half of the interview, I had to go back and correct my audio. I had a microphone problem that I didn't realize until after we were done recording. So some of my later questions and points, you'll notice the sound difference because I had to go back and re-record it. But with that caveat, let's begin. All right, well, welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be sitting down today with historian and mathematician Marcus Du Sautoy, and this is definitely a different kind of a book for me. Usually it's a hardcore narrative sort of history of a region or a period, but when the opportunity came up to get the book, I just jumped at it because I am a huge game person. And the book, Around the World in 80 Games, a mathematician unlocks the secrets of the greatest games. I mean, how could I not jump all over that idea right there? So it's a great book. I enjoyed reading it. I'm sure everybody who's listening is going to enjoy reading it as well. And I wanted to get in and start to talk about some of these games because I grew up with games as an essential part of sort of my upbringings. Most of my fondest memories are of playing different games with my family throughout the years. And so I definitely wanted to talk about that for a little bit, but I thought we could start out with an interesting question that you address in the book, which is, why do human beings play games? Are games essential to sort of what it means to be a human? Like, I think that those are really interesting questions.
Well, I think your reaction, Adam, to the book, you got excited about a book about games. Actually, I think that's quite universal. I think as a species, we do just seem to love playing different sorts of games. And there's even been a proposal that we should rename ourselves not Homo sapiens, but Homo ludens, the humans who love to play games, that it's actually a really essential part of how we became who we are. And I think that's the point because, a game is actually a very safe kind of space to explore possibilities. So I think even, if you look at animals also as young animals play games, and it's a little bit about experimenting with hunting or with sort of connecting with your fellow animals. But I think they sort of stop playing as adult animals, and that's what differentiates us as a species, that we enjoy playing games well into adulthood. And I think it's quite connected to the development of consciousness in the human species, that allowed us to do two things. One was to do a kind of mental time travel. Consciousness allows us to kind of think ourselves in the future. And in a way, a game is a little bit like doing that. It's about imagining a scenario and playing out the rules of that scenario and exploring what could happen. It's a great place to sort of plan. But I think that makes games a bit too utilitarian, and we play games not for utility but for fun. And I think but we play games with other people, and I think that's the really important thing. The games I talk about are not often games that you play on your own, but games you play with other people. And I think games are a little bit a way of exploring the mind of the other. It's a way, we've suddenly developed an inner world, and we want to kind of explore the inner world of the other. Playing a game is actually quite a nice place to kind of explore that, to bond as a group, to think about how others think about the game. So, and actually, I talked to I went to India just recently, and in India, an arranged marriage, often you don't know who you're marrying, and they use games as a way for the couple to start to get to know each other.
It doesn't surprise me. I find that really interesting. And there's a couple of really, I think, important points here. And that is, first of all, games are intended to be entertaining. And in a second, I kind of want to get into what separates a game from a non-game, because there are activities, of course, that can maybe look like games in a lot of ways, but they're not at the end of the day. And the other thing that I think is so important is that human connection. I just don't, certainly growing up in the age that I grew up in, computer games were introduced as I was getting a little bit older. And when you're playing computer games, you can play against the computer. But it's very different, as anybody, especially who's played an older, and we'll talk about some of them later on, computer game will tell you that when you get in a certain scenario, the computer is going to do the same thing every time, because, it's programmed to make the right move, and that is the right move in that situation. And so it never deviates from that course, which changes the nature of the game a little bit, I think. And it kind of reduces that entertainment level, because there's part of the thing that's great about games is the ability to take risks without a huge downside. If you lose your shirt in Monopoly, you own an actual house still. Okay, no one's gonna come and take your house away from you. Even though you lost everything. So you can kind of take those opportunities. But I do think we should set out what is a game, because you do that in the book, and I think it's crucial to kind of understanding okay, what are we going to talk about here, and what are we not going to talk about? So what are the essential elements that make something a game?
Well, this is actually quite a challenging question to answer. And I talk about this in the book because Wittgenstein uses the word game as his example of something which is actually very hard to pin down. The way we develop language is to play something called the language game, that we use a word and we gradually explore what is included in that word, what's excluded. And that language isn't something that can be so simply pinned down by a kind of sequence of definitions of what constitutes a game or not. So curiously, I think the book is a way of playing Wittgenstein's language game and sort of exploring, well, I think this is what I want to include as a game, but I'm not going to include this. And I think a lot of people will be open for a good argument over this book and say, but why didn't you include this sort of game? But I do sort of start to address what I think does make the good quality of a game. And quite a lot of sort of philosophers of games have agreed on these. And one of them is really important, which is, I think, free will. That you should be entering into a game by choice. If you're not, it's really turning into work. So that sort of differentiation is something which is you're entering into freely. There's also a kind of really interesting element of a game, which is its separateness. that it's kind of got a separate time zone, often a separate place. You're kind of creating almost an alternative world with that game. And I think that's often quite important. It's got its own timescale, its own kind of world. It's almost got make-believe in it in some way, that you're sort of setting up a world in which you're going to live in, which is why I think it's actually quite close to my own subject of mathematics, which is, you're setting up a kind of space that you're going to explore, and it need not replicate the world around you. It might be very different. And that's another thing. I think you're looking for something which has quite clear rules, and people kind of differentiate, life is very messy and doesn't have clear rules, and often we want to play a game because we're enjoying playing within the confines of very clear set kind of lines of engagement. So I think that's also important. I think the other thing to really celebrate is it's inherently unproductive. That you shouldn't be doing this because you're trying to, get better at life or something. I mean, yeah, you might have sort of secondary benefits of playing games, but they're not really what. So there should be a sort of almost a kind of waste of time in a way, that that it shouldn't be useful to something. So, somebody who's playing the casino to make money is not playing a game, they're working. But somebody who just wants to spend the night in the casino and doesn't mind losing money or making money, it's not the role. They're enjoying the playing rather than the kind of productive side of earning sort of money. So I think if you want a really neat short definition, there's a guy called Bernard Sweets who wrote a wonderful book called The Grasshopper, Games, Life and Utopia. And he has a really nice, very succinct definition, which kind of really is a challenge to Wittgenstein in a sense. He says, playing a game is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And I'd like that. That kind of captures the voluntary, the free will, and these kind of weird obstacles that you've put there. They're unnecessary, some rules, but you're going to try and overcome these rules to get to the end of the game.
Yeah, and I think that, I think the voluntary part of it is so important, because if it's not voluntary, then there's not the entertainment value that would exist otherwise. And I think inherent to some of the things that you're also talking about is that this idea that you enter to play the game and there are these rules and everyone has an opportunity to win. I think that's an important part of the game. When everybody starts in Monopoly, everybody starts with the same amount of money. Nobody starts as like the rich guy and then the poor guy who doesn't own anything, and the rich guy already owns everything on the board. That's not a fun game. Nobody wants to do that. Because that's not, at some point, I hate to say it, but at some point that actually becomes too real. At some point if a game becomes too real, in that certain players just have inherent advantages that cannot be overcome, it's not entertaining anymore. It's not fun. And that's not to say that everybody is the same. One of my favorite board games, war games, growing up was a game called Axis and Allies. It's a old Hasbro game. You're replaying World War II essentially from the entrance of the United States. So December 1941, that sort of era. And yes, absolutely. And different people have done studies on the games, and the Allies have a tremendous advantage. There's no doubt about that. But the other side can win. You can win, and that's that sort of dissonance and that entertainment value that make games so much fun. Even if you come in at a disadvantage, knowing that you still have the opportunity to win, I think that's really cool. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you've absolutely hit on something which is important about when a game works well. And in a funny way, that's why I think chess can be a very difficult game, because if you've got two people who are mismatched, it's very difficult, because it's a pure strategy game, for the weaker player to enjoy playing that game. And that's why, the first game out of those 80 games I choose is backgammon, because I think that has a sweet spot of, there's certainly strategy there, but there's also an element of luck. And I think that's an important part of a really good game, which is which kind of equalizes things up a little bit, which means that the slightly weaker player still has a chance to win, which really they don't in chess. But in backgammon, you've still got to use your throws of the dice. If you have got good dice, you can still mess it up if you don't play good strategy. But I think that element of chance is actually also quite an important component that I think the best games sort of exploit. And chess is great when it's two people equally matched, but really not much fun when you've got a kind of weak player playing. But I think backgammon, weak player will still have the chance to win against a strong player at backgammon. So, but you don't want something which is complete chance. So, I talk about snakes and ladders, or chutes and ladders, I think it's called in the US, which is a beautiful history behind that game, because it turns out to have its origins in India. It turns out to be a game actually about reaching nirvana, and it's a moralistic game. But if you play that, you're a bit of the cog in the machine, because there's no strategy there. It's just the roll of the dice. So it's this really lovely balance that I think you're looking for between something with a bit of chance but not so much chance that, frankly, you're not really involved other than the machine that's throwing the dice.
Yeah, and I'll play Candyland like with my daughter, and that's a pure chance game that you're just playing for that sort of fun involvement. But first of all, I have to take a time out and thank you. I'd never played backgammon before. I read your book. Purchased a set, and my wife and I took it on vacation. It's a perfect travel game, by the way, if you're listening to this. The board, it rolls up, it unrolls, it's simple pieces, and it works if you've never played it. It's kind of like Parcheesi in that you have to move your pieces around the board, and you can get bumped off, and you have to start over, and those sorts of things. There's more to it than that, but it struck me as I was playing it as just this perfect game of a combination of chance, because if you get doubles, it's a huge advantage in the beginning of the game. But at the end of the game, you could get double sixes, and it's a disadvantage because you can't get any of your pieces home. So the interesting thing is how the dynamics of the game will change throughout the game. And those are the games that I love, where it's not the same strategy that works at the beginning of the game that's going to be effective at the end of the game. But you can absolutely still win by just getting lucky. And that's okay too.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I think there's another interesting component about backgammon, which is also essential, which the rules should be simple enough that you get them within a couple of minutes of reading the instructions. I've bought board games which, I've tried to play with my family, and my family just switch off after 5 minutes because the rule book is so long and involved, and I think that's it's also what makes the best mathematics is to have a very simple little setup, yet when you sort of explore the mathematics, it has kind of infinite complexity and variety in it. And I think the best games are those which have a very simple set of rules, something like backgammon or the great Chinese game of Go, which is just black and white stones on a 19 by 19 grid, and you're just trying to surround your opponent's stones. That's basically the rules. But yet every game is a completely different story. And I think that's also important, story. The element of this game should be telling you some sort of story. It should have a narrative to it, beginning, middle, and an end. That's, chess is the perfect example of that. It really has those three stages, just like a really beautiful story. So I think some of the best games are those that, simple set of rules, yet every time you tell the story, it's different. Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes. But also, I think the other element is the family element because that game we actually got as a family game, and I think you mentioned it right at the beginning. It's very much part of our family upbringing, and I dedicated this book to my sister, who was my companion in many of these games, and in Dungeons and Dragons, she certainly was. But I think it's very interesting because some games, as you say, are very abstract and do not have a story to them, and still we enjoy the kind of puzzle element of it, the abstract nature of it. Often card games very often are not, by their nature, got a story to them. If you're playing whist or bridge or rummy, it's enjoying that kind of. There's the collecting element of it, or the competitive nature of trumping people and things like that. But then there are other games which are just absolutely, the story is so much part of it. And I think that actually really sort of developed when kind of Europe, and in particular Germany, took over the mantle of making games in the last few decades. And in an interesting way, you mentioned the game which was somehow replicating the Second World War. And there was a period when, many games that were on the market were kind of war games. And they were, like Risk. It's about taking over the world, and maybe it's a Second World War, or maybe it's a medieval kind of framework. And, Germany really reacted against that because, they had laws about not celebrating war after the Second World War. And so actually game developers were really pushed to kind of come up with something different as a story. War is quite good to make into a game, and it always has been there, right back to the Romans. I mean, I talk about it's just a natural. Games are about competition with somebody else, which naturally has a sense of kind of playing warfare. And so the Germans were kind of pushed into trying to come up with games which didn't have that as a narrative, yet still had some story element to them. And so you start to see, games like The Settlers of Catan, which is a story about settling a land and sort of developing a civilization on that land. And I think, that's what's interesting, seeing this kind of turning away from games which replicate war to games which are exploring other things. And you're starting to see, for example, in the gaming industry, a lot more women game developers. There have always been a lot of women game players, but there's always been a kind of dominance of men in the development of games. But now you're seeing really interesting games like Plot a Lot, which is a game about growing a garden, or games about nature and birds. But I think people, games are they are about stories, even in their abstract sense. So I think they naturally just sit very well if they're coached inside some sort of story. It's a bit like, playing a game is a bit like sitting around the campfire where we shared our stories. And instead of singing songs or telling stories, I think, very early on as a species, we sat around the campfire and played games together.
Yeah, and I think, it's actually really interesting that you bring up. I didn't think about that until right now, that a lot of the games that I've purchased in the last 15 to 20 years are German-made games, and a lot of the games that we play, I just purchased a 2-player version of Settlers of Catan, which was a good game, but it's a great example of we had backgammon and then we had this game, and the rule book for the Catan is 10, 15 pages long. Whereas the rule book for backgammon, you could fit on one playing card if you wanted to, and you sort of have the basic setup. And they're both fun. And they're both very sort of different in how they work. One is just much more complicated than the other. I also think of a game like Carcassonne, which I believe is another German made game. It's essentially a castle building game. But it's not war focused, and that I think that there's a lot to that. I think you don't see maybe as many war games hitting the market as you certainly did, when I was a kid. That's not to say that there aren't. any. And I think one of the more interesting developments in games that you're seeing more and more recently are board games where people aren't necessarily playing against each other. But you are essentially playing against the game. You have a counter or something that you have to accomplish the mission before that. I think there's an interesting sort of collectivist idea here happening for the first time, because I don't recall ever seeing games like that up until maybe the last decade, 15 years or so. And now they're very common.
I think this is one of the exciting new developments in games. I mean, games are so ancient that in some ways, although I kept on meeting many different games, they all were sort of, it's almost like there are only 7 stories. There are almost only 7 games. Is it a racing game like backgammon or Pachisi, or is it a collecting game like Mahjong or Rummy? But I think this was a really interesting new development. The idea of you playing together as a group, sort of against the game. And, one of the first to kind of explore this idea was a game called Pandemic, which actually was developed by a man who was playing with his wife, and they always got into these really bad arguments because, he would exploit all the tricks he had in his book to try and beat his wife at this game. And it sort of, at the evenings always ended in tears. And so he said, oh my gosh, I need to develop something where we're sort of together and working together. So that was his motivation, to kind of make a game where there's a kind of collective and that but it's, as he talked about this game, it's very difficult to make such a game because, the temptation is that one person just starts to lead the strategy and others kind of get left behind and just follow what the other person is doing. So structuring a game collectively such that everyone is playing a role in there, I think is, the real art of making a good collaborative game. But a lot of these new developments, especially in Germany, and this kind of idea of the new collaborative games, actually were inspired by the development of a prize for games that was created in Germany. It's called Spiel des Jahres, the game of the year. And this is a bit like the Nobel Prize for game development. And so the game actually has to be published in Germany, as well as elsewhere. But this game, this prize, I think really inspired a lot of new ideas for game development to try and win this prize. So I think you could probably credit that prize as being why we've seen such innovation in Europe, especially over the last kind of 20 years in development of games.
And, there's a lot that goes into thinking of what is going to be a component of a successful game. I think, a lot of people might look at a Monopoly or something like that and say, well, that's a really rudimentary concept. But there's a lot more moving parts there than you think. As an educator, I like to teach a lot with games. So I'm constantly trying to come up with new, usually historical simulation style games. But you have to think, what are all the people doing? Everybody needs to be doing something for the game to work. How is the game going to be paced? A game that's too slow is not going to be interesting. But on the other hand, a game that moves too fast is over before there's an opportunity to sort of develop that heightened sense of tension that's important to a high quality game as well. And the instructions have to be, I say, learnable in 5 minutes or less, in order for it to be something that most people will be willing to invest the time in. There are those. I played some war games when I was a kid, where there's a book, and you have to look at the chart because different units get a +1 or -7 depending upon who they're fighting, and so on and so forth. And those games are fun, but everybody has to, again, getting back to the voluntary aspect of games, everybody has to be willing to go down that road. And if you're not willing to invest the time to do that, then that's not going to be something that's of interest to you. But I wanted you to tell a story from the book because I thought it was such a cool story that just illustrates the power of games that can have over people, even when they're sometimes being forced to suffer through physical discomfort to play the game. because you tell this story with this young woman ingesting peppers to try to teach her this interesting mathematical lesson, and I just thought it was such a cool story about the nature of human beings in games. So if you wouldn't mind telling that story, I think it's really neat.
Well, I'm the same as you, Adam, that I enjoy using games as a way of teaching, and games often help you to put across a message, because everyone just loves playing games, so they will engage and want to kind of learn what it is about this game that was going to help them to play. So kind of the thesis of the book is that games are a way of playing mathematics, that under every game there is an interesting piece of maths, and if you understand that, then it can often give you an edge. So I developed this game which is called Chocolate Chili Roulette, and there's a certain number of chocolates on the table and one chili, and you're allowed to take one or two, three chocolates at a time, and you take it in turns until there are no chocolates on the table, and whoever's turn it is next has to eat the chili. Now, if you understand the kind of maths underpinning this game, it gives you the edge such that if you start, you can always get the other player to eat the chili. So I always play this game when I go into schools, and this girl volunteered. She came up, played the game the first time where I'm guaranteed a win, and she ate the chili. Now, unfortunately, I hadn't checked these chilies before I arrived at the school, because I just picked them up at a grocer's on the way down. And I saw she was in quite a lot of discomfort. She seemed to be sweating quite a lot. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to let her start next time. If she understands the maths, she'll be able to make me eat the chili. But she didn't kind of get what the maths underpinning this was on the first time round, and I won again, and she had to eat another chili. By this time I could see she was actually beginning to physically shake, and I was like, oh dear. We played a third, I said, do you want to sit down and I'll let another student play? And here was the other element. She was so determined to beat me. This is the fun thing about a game. You really want to win. So she says, no, I'm going to do a third time. And third time she lost again. She still hadn't got it. And by that time, she was pouring with sweat. So I explained what the strategy was in order to get her to win and make me eat the chili. At which point, I was unable to continue the session because the chilies were so hot that I was just kind of... So I understood why she was in such pain. But I think she probably learnt the little mathematical lesson that was at the heart of that game, and probably never made that mistake again. And I certainly never made the mistake of not trying the chilies before I started that kind of game with another session. But it was chilies are quite a good way to learn the maths underlying a game.
Yeah, but as anybody will tell you, it's you enter the game because it's going to be fun. But of course, you enter the game because you want to win. I mean, there are, whether you're playing against someone else or you're playing against the computer, you're playing against the board, there is a winner and there's someone who loses at the end. And we enter in, hoping to win. And it's that sort of expectation that also just kind of that's what makes a game fun. There has to be a winner and a loser. There has to be. Otherwise, the essential element of the game doesn't come into play. Well, I thought I want to bring up a couple of games, and then if there's time, we can talk about a few more. But there's a few games that are just sort of my favorites that I thought, we could talk about a little bit because they're fun. One of the games that I play most consistently now with other couples and so on and so forth is Ticket to Ride, that you talk about in the book. And for those who aren't familiar, Ticket to Ride is essentially, it's a train game. You build tracks of trains from cities to cities, and there's all different versions, and you get different points based off of the length of the tracks that you lay down and whether or not you connect different cities together. And at the end of the game, everyone reveals the connections that they've made and the number of points that they have. So it's at its core a relatively simple game with an element of luck because you don't have control over the cards that you draw, but you do have control over the strategy that you adopt to try to connect those cities. So I think it's a great game because it's got a wonderful balance of both. But the way that you kind of break down the sort of risk-inducing behavior in the game, I think was really interesting. So I was hoping you could tell people about that for a second because I thought it was pretty cool.
I think it is a brilliant game, and it's one that I play a lot with my family, partly again because they they got the game very quickly. But the game, I think making a game is a real art and a real science as well, because, you mentioned the word balance, and that's absolutely essential here, because the way you score points in this game is very carefully kind of rigged, such that, it isn't clear what strategy you should adopt. Should you collect lots of short kind of connections, or should you take the risk of going for a very long one and failing to get it? And the gearing of the point system is really what makes this game tick. And I'm sure when they were developing this game that there was a lot of kind of trialing. There's a lot of, you have to play this game with a lot of people in order to make the thing work. And but the other beautiful thing about this game as well is that you don't know who's won until right at the end. And I think that that's really essential in a game. And I think it's why Monopoly, although everyone always goes to Monopoly as their sort of default game of choice, at Christmas or any of the holidays, actually I think it's a dreadfully badly built game, because very quickly you realize somebody is dominating this game, and then you just spend the whole game with this person basically bankrupting everyone else, and it's very hard to kind of disrupt that bias that starts to get into the game. Whilst with Tickets to Ride, really only right up until the last minute you really find out who's won, which I think is really important in a game. You shouldn't know who's won until really almost at the end. But I do analyze the way the game is geared, and I think this is why people should buy the book, partly because they're going to learn a few strategies of games they do play, which should help them when they're competing next when they play the game. And when I looked at Tickets to Ride, it turns out there's a slight kind of bias towards those people who take the risk of trying to do very long journeys across whatever continent you're playing the game on. And the original game is America, which I think is nice, because you're taking a risk rather than going for little short tracks. You're taking the risk, so the reward should be big if you're taking a big risk, and that's certainly how that game is geared. So quite a few of the games I analyze, and I give readers a little bit of a strategy than what the maths tells you the way you should play this game. And Ticket to Ride, it turns out you should go for the long, big journeys across America.
All right, well, the next game that I really want to ask about is one of my all-time favorites, Risk. Risk is a game I grew up growing with my family. We would play it on Christmas, then I would grow up and I would play it with my friends later on. The sort of quintessential game that there's never any end to, because it never seems like anyone can completely wipe out the other person. But sort of like the ultimate, I guess you would say, war game that most people are at least familiar with, if for no other reason than for the somewhat, apocalyptic game that is played on Seinfeld in one of the last few seasons, back and forth there. But I've always kind of wondered, what's the right strategy with Risk? Because I've tried a number of different things, and sometimes I feel like they work very well, and sometimes they don't. I tend to adopt more of a defensive strategy myself, especially if I can get boxed into sort of Oceania or Australia and so on and so forth is. But I'm never really been clear that that's actually the right way to play the game. And I know a lot of it has to do with who you're playing against. But to me, it seems like much more of a question of, from a mathematical perspective, what's better? Is it better in Risk to play the defensive game, or is it better in Risk to be hyper aggressive and to take that approach of, I'm going to attack first and, let the chips fall where they may?
Yeah, there are two really interesting mathematical components to Risk. One is the connected nature of the board, because you occupy different countries and you look to actually own a whole continent, and there's a real question about which of these continents is it better to play from. Some are highly connected, some are quite isolated. So this actually comes down to something called in mathematics topology, which is about looking at the way things are networked together, a bit like here I live in London, where the London Underground map shows you the connections between stations. And so actually analysing that map is quite an interesting component to understanding where you want to place your armies down right at the beginning. But the other really interesting component is the one you mentioned, which is, should I actually sort of sit and be defensive and let people attack me? Is that, do I have an advantage if if I'm defending my country, or should I be more aggressive and attack? And actually, it's been quite unclear for some time, and there was a mathematical analysis which first revealed that the mathematician thought that defending your territory is actually the better strategy. But what they failed to understand is a really interesting thing in probability, which is about independent and dependent events. So sometimes, if I roll two dice, the two dice are actually independent of each other. If the one dice rolls 6 and the other rolls, it's not going to influence whether the other dice rolls 5. So when you're rolling dice, which is what you do when you're attacking and defending, it feels like the dice should be independent. But then you realize actually there is a dependence there, because you've actually got to take the leading dice of your 3 against the top dice of your opponent's 2. So it turns out to be a dependence which was missed on the first mathematical analysis. And when somebody subsequently did it, it turned out it actually changed the strategy you should use. So this dependency between the dice when you're playing Risk, it turns out that being aggressive is a much better strategy than just sitting back and defending. But it's a real subtle point in the mathematics of probability, which some mathematicians have got wrong. So it's not surprising that people are never too sure playing that game, what is the best strategy. But, ultimately we now know when you're playing Risk with your granny next Christmas, attack, attack, attack.
Okay, well, sometimes there are scenarios wherein one person is playing the game for fun and the other person is playing the game for financial gain, or sometimes the organization is. And of course, I'm talking about casinos. So I feel like I would be remiss, because there is a section in the book where you talk about casinos and the different games that are there. And I've always kind of wondered, and I was curious when I opened that part of the book of, what's the best if I have to go to a casino and I want to go, what's the best game to play? Should you play blackjack? Should you play roulette? Should you play poker? Obviously it comes down to, what do you enjoy the most, since only a fool goes in thinking they're going to make money. But I guess I've always wondered, the house is supposed to win, but to what extent does math declare that they're going to win no matter what?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of casinos will employ mathematicians absolutely to ensure in the long run that they're going to come out on top. And, I looked at roulette in particular because I think that's a really nice game to explain why the casinos are going to come out on top. Because, the reward you get for, choosing the right number is not really equal to the number of possibilities that are on that roulette wheel, because you've got that 0 and sometimes double 0 on the wheel. So there is a little bit of an edge given to the casino, which in the long run means they always come out on top. So every time you play, you pay. And you've got to realize that this is the rule of the casino. Every time you go in, and there's a really interesting little puzzle, which I'll challenge your listeners with. You've got $20 and you want to try and produce a strategy on the roulette wheel to double your money. So there are two options. You could either put the $20 down on red in one go, or you could put them $1 at a time on red. And the question is, which is the better strategy in order to try and walk away with double your money? Now, if you put it all down in one go, it's 50-50 chance, basically, that you're going to win. And, it's a pretty, either you win and you leave, or you lose and the game's over. If you play $1 at a time, I think most people think, yeah, that should be the better option. But it turns out that if you do that, there's only a 1 in 4 chance, rather than a 1 in 2 chance, that you're going to double your money. And you've got to think, every time I'm putting $1 down, essentially I'm paying to play. And so if I'm playing more, I'm paying more. And this is why, although it's a rather boring night out, it's better just to put everything down in one go and either leave empty-handed or you've doubled your money. But I do analyze the roulette wheel, and there are certain places where your odds are slightly better. You lose less money. You're never going to find somewhere where you're going to win. But the strategy is, where should I play in order to lose in money more slowly than anywhere else? And it turns out that there's some roulette wheels play something called en prison, which is if you put your money down on red and the green 0 or double 0 comes up, then you can keep your money there. So it's actually means that you don't pay out on that round. So it means you're, in the end, paying out less to the casino if the casino is playing en prison, if you play on red. So that's my only little help to, basically, you're absolutely right, Adam, that, if you go to the casino, just expect in the long run to be down and the casino to be up.
But of course, the casinos aren't playing a game in the way that the person is, right? That's not fun for them.
Yeah, they're not playing a game, exactly. And the point is that you need to go into a casino really just being happy to play, and you're happy to pay to play. I mean, if you're trying to make money, then the casino is not the best place to go.
All right, I want to end with kind of like a wrap-up question, because there are so many games that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about. But I guess I thought if there was one or maybe even two games that most people you think maybe haven't heard of, but should definitely pick up and give a try, like what would the recommendations be from your end? And I know that everybody's going to enjoy different things, and I enjoy different games than a lot of other people who don't like them. But I was just amazed by the number of different cultural games here from different parts of the world. And I just thought, hey, if you could sit down next to someone and say, definitely take a look at this game or that game, what would it be?
That's such a tricky question, because in some ways, tell me the game you play and I'll tell you who you are. That it's sort of almost, to actually try and pick one of these games for people. But I think, if people haven't come across certain games like, I love the game of Mahjong, for example, which is a Chinese game where it's kind of a card game, but the cards are actually tiles, and it's an aesthetically very satisfying game, and kind of has a feeling of being somewhere foreign, because the symbols on the Mahjong tiles, it's a Chinese game, so you've got Chinese characters. I really enjoy the way games can take you to somewhere else, and that's why this is really a journey around the world. To take you to kind of interesting new places. So, but the interesting thing is when you start playing that game, you actually say, "Hey, although this game looks very foreign to me, I recognize it a bit, because it's actually a kind of version of Rummy, where you're collecting runs of things. You're collecting 3 types of dragon, or what I found time and again is that even if I found a game which looked very, very foreign to me, when I started playing it, quite often it would connect with a game that I know about. I think the greatest invention humanity ever made was the pack of cards, because a pack of cards, I think, and that's what I mean, in the book I talk about lots of different cards from different parts of the world. I mean, there's a beautiful game if you go to Japan, the Hanafuda cards, which are, really beautiful little, quite thick cards. I mean, the pack of cards is really quite high when you stack them up. And when you look at the cards, you're not even sure it's a game. There are pictures of flowers, of gardens, of animals. And actually, this was because cards and gambling was banned at some point, and they needed to make something which didn't look like you were playing a game. And so they're little cards. Actually, you can hide them very quickly in your hand. It was a time when Japan was actually becoming very anti-Western. So Western cards that had come, via Portugal to Japan were banned. And these new cards sort of developed developed. And I got a set of cards sent over to me, and they are just aesthetically really beautiful. And again, it's a sort of collecting game. You're trying to get particular combinations of things, but it's a bit like Mahjong, where there are very special combinations of cards that kind of connect to the culture. That have very special names and things like that. So I quite like those two games as something rather special. But if you were going to really push me to, like which of these games is your favorite or something, I'd probably choose a game that actually doesn't really exist, because the last game in the book is actually a game that's talked about in a novel that I loved ever since I was a student. It's called The Glass Bead Game. It's a novel by Hermann Hesse, and it's about a game which is kind of played by these monks. It's a kind of futuristic game, and it's a kind of game where you have to fuse many different parts of culture. You sort of bring together music, history, geography, mathematics, science in the kind of playing of this game, and it's almost like telling a story through this game. And I think that when I read that book, that was the game that I sort of wanted to spend my life playing. And I knew it didn't exist, but in a way, I think my whole life as a mathematician and all of the other things I love doing, writing, playing music, doing theatre, are all my attempts to play the game that's talked about in this book, and the Glass Bead Game. And in a way, I think, like this new book I've written, Around the World in 80 Games, is sort of my next move in this game, the Glass Bead Game, in my attempt to sort of culturally fuse in this one book the ideas of mathematics, science, history, culture, geography, storytelling. And that's what I hope the book is. It's a kind of fusion of just all of these things which makes us human.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really hope that people pick up the book. It's an excellent book. We only scratched the surface. There's 80 games here, folks. We talked about 5 or 6. So there's something in it for everybody. And I hope that people enjoy playing games with one another. I think that's something that maybe we sort of rediscovered as a result of COVID. And that's been one of those nice, extra benefits of something that was so long and so not fun. But at the end of the day, it's good for us to reconnect in our humanity and understand that games are part of the things that make that happen. Now, as I said before, link in the show notes. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I truly hope that people pick up the book, because it's a lot of fun. Grab a copy of the book and a copy of Backgammon if there's absolutely nothing else that you do from this.
Oh, absolute pleasure, and always a joy to talk games with anybody. I think, as you say, games are so much part of our life that it's something we just love spending our time doing. And when the artificial intelligence has taken away our jobs, there'll still be the games there for us to play and enjoy.